In June of 2021, on the TV show America's Got Talent, a singer by the name of Jane McNitzky, better known by her artist name Nightbird, came forward and sang an original song, It's Okay, to the panel of judges. Now, Jane McNitzky is famous because she actually made the Simon Cowell tear up by her performance. Now, if you listen to the AHUMC Connect playlist, you'll have noticed that Colin put this song on our playlist for today's worship service. But before she performed in June of 2021, just a few months prior, in March of 2021, Jane McNitzky wrote a blog. And the title of this blog post was called, God is on the Bathroom Floor. And to kind of set the tone and connect with our passage from Ruth this morning, I want to invite you to read along with me. The words will be on the screen as we read the opening part of this blog post, God is on the bathroom floor. This is what Nightbird wrote. I've had cancer 3 times now, and I have barely passed 30. On nights that I could not sleep, I laid in the tub like an insect, staring at my reflection in the shower knob. I vomited until I was hollow. The bathroom floor became my place to hide, where I could scream and be ugly, where I could sob and spit and eventually doze off, happy to be asleep, even with my head on the toilet. There are times when I wonder what I must have done to deserve such a story. I fear sometimes that when I die and meet with God, that God will say I disappointed him or offended him or failed him. Maybe God will say I just never learned the lesson. But one thing I know for sure is this. God can never say that God didn't know me. I am God's downstairs neighbor banging on the ceiling with a broomstick. I show up at God's door every day. Sometimes I use my key under the mat to let myself in. Other times, I sulk outside until God opens the door. I have called God a liar and a cheat, and I meant it. I have told God that I wanted to die, and I meant it. Tears have become the only prayer I know. Prayers roll over my nostrils and drip down my forearms. These are the prayers I repeat night and day. I wonder if those words sound strange to you. Maybe they make us feel a little uncomfortable. But these words from Nightbird actually connect to a long tradition of how God's people talk to God and talk about God. Words that we find here at the end of Ruth chapter 1. Words that come from the mouth of Naomi. Words of pain, of honesty, of hopelessness. I wonder if you knew that chapter 1 of Ruth ends in such a dark and gloomy moment. I mean, it's strange the way that this portion of chapter 1 begins, right? We learned last week that Ruth is a Moabite, which is an ancestral enemy of the people of God. Nothing good, nobody good comes from Moab. And yet, the book of Ruth begins by talking about this woman who is married into Naomi's family, now widowed, just like Naomi. And Ruth has chosen to journey back with Naomi back to the land that is promised to Israel, to the town of Bethlehem. And we picked up in verse 14 of Ruth chapter 1, where we hear that word clung. Ruth clung to Naomi. And that word should be familiar to you because this morning in leading us in our gathering prayer, Chris and all of you prayed that our soul clings to God. It's the same word in Hebrew. It's davak. And it's a covenant faithfulness of two people coming together and uniting. No matter the circumstances, they won't be separated. So Ruth clings to Naomi, this woman who would be considered God-forsaken by anybody else with any common sense. Naomi has journeyed to a forbidden land, has lost her sons and her husband, which means she has no social security, no safety net. She's on her own. And it appears, if you put 2 and 2 together, that Naomi has broken God's law. So she has been punished for it. So anybody with eyes to see thousands of years ago would deduce that Naomi is cursed. She's cut off. And yet, the person who decides to stick with her, no matter the odds, is the Moabite, Ruth. So it says in verse 14, Ruth clings to Naomi. And then she has this beautiful poem, which you might have read at wedding ceremonies, where she says, "Do not encourage me to leave you." And it's this poem displaying her covenant faithfulness. Do you remember last week we talked about that Hebrew word chesed, which means steadfast love or covenant faithful loyalty? However you translate it, we read it today in Psalm 63. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. Hesed, usually a quality that is revealed by the God of Israel to God's people. That God will be loyal and faithful no matter the cost. And yet, in a surprising twist of events, it's a Moabite woman, somebody who stands outside the covenant relationship, that is embodying this quality. The last person we'd expect to be faithful and pointing to the living God is Ruth. And yet this poem in verses 16 through 17 suggests she knows exactly who God is and how God calls us to live as people made in God's image. And in fact, the way that she ends the poem is in this way: "May the Lord do thus and so to me, and even more as well, if even death parts me from you." If even death parts me from you. Now, if you're married and you said your wedding vows in the traditional language, you might have said, "Until death parts us." So these words from Ruth are even stronger than your wedding vows. Because Ruth says, not even death is going to come between me and you. Nothing will separate me from you, Naomi. And I wonder if your brain is already thinking about another passage that comes thousands of years later in Paul's letter to the church in Rome. In chapter 8, one of the most beautiful expositions of God's love. In verse 38 of chapter 8, Paul writes, "What can separate us from the love of God?" And he goes on this litany. And he says, "I am convinced that neither death nor life." And he lists all of these things we typically see as obstacles. He says, nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Where do you think Paul's getting that language? He sees it in this person, Ruth, who embodies God's steadfast loyalty and love. But this is where it gets strange. How does Naomi respond to these moving words from the Moabite woman? She says nothing. Maybe she had her breath taken away. Maybe she was anxious about having to care for another person besides herself. Maybe she was worried about what her community would think when she brings this Moabite woman in tow with her. Whatever it is, the story doesn't tell us, the author doesn't reveal, but all it says is that Naomi said nothing more to Ruth, and they journeyed together in silence back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. When she gets there, she's met by a buzz, excitement. The people of the town are thrilled or maybe shocked and appalled to see Naomi return after being away 10 years. They ask and exclaim, "Is this Naomi?" Now, the tone of that question also isn't revealed. Are they shocked? Are they thrilled? Are they asking derisively, scoffing? Whatever the case, the town opens its arms to receive Naomi. And how does Naomi respond? This time, not with silence, but she opens her mouth, and here it comes. Words of pain, anger, anguish about where she is in life, what state she's in, and how God has treated her. I'll read them again for you. Verse 20, Naomi said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara." Mara means bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Ellen Davis, who's a professor at Duke Divinity School and has a fantastic translation of the book of Ruth, notes that the word "the Almighty" in Naomi's Psalm of Lament, that word is actually a name for God, El Shaddai, or Shaddai, if you read the Hebrew text here. Shaddai is one of the oldest names we have in Scripture for this God that we worship. And where you find Shaddai showing up the most in the Hebrew scriptures, first it's the book of Genesis, talking about our primordial beginnings as creation. And the book that mentions Shaddai the second most in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job. The book of Job is one of the most ancient texts we have in the Hebrew canon. But the book of Job thinks about God a little bit differently than a lot of the canon does. And Job often refers to God as Shaddai in a way that kind of paints God as this mysterious figure who's sometimes hostile toward humanity. And if you know the story of Job, it's about this righteous man who seems to be an innocent victim, and that God does nothing to prevent Job's suffering. So I wonder if the author of Ruth is trying to connect our brains to that story in Job. That Naomi is not going to be punished because of some rules that we think she might have broken, that maybe she's actually suffering as an innocent victim, much like Job. Whatever the case, she is taking it out on God. She's not holding it back. And that last line, the Almighty has caused calamity upon me, Ellen Davis translates it a little more harshly than the NRSV. Ellen Davis says that the Lord has done evil to me. Pretty strong words to note against the God who we claim loves us, sustains us, nurtures us, keeps us alive every moment. Naomi feels differently. In her pain, in her grief and emptiness, she lets loose a barrage against the God that she worships. And all the while, Ruth the Moabite, who traveled from Moab, you can see that the text is emphasizing Moab still in associating Ruth's identity, or connecting us with Ruth's identity. Moab gets repeated, emphasized over and over. All the while, Ruth stands there. She doesn't leave Naomi's side. She's returned. She's there. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read words like this, and in my own context, as an American here in 2024 in the southern United States, my wife will pick a bone with that. We'll talk about it later. I don't know if Texas is the South, but in our southern evangelical world that I was raised in, I'm not comfortable with how Naomi talks about God. I wonder if you've ever been comfortable with how Naomi might speak of the God that we worship. And I think if we feel uncomfortable with these words from Naomi, it reveals something. It betrays something about the faith we've been handed. And it's that we've been disconnected from a faithful and long line of how the Bible relates and converses with the God of the universe. These psalms of pain, these songs of anguish, they're not foreign to the faith that we call Christianity. In fact, it reveals much about who we are, the fact that we come here on Sunday mornings and we expect like an injection of happiness and sunshine. A lot of churches base their Sunday morning services on you feeling good when you come out of their space. That's the goal. It's that you feel hyped up for Jesus by the end of it. And yet the faithful way of talking about God, one of the faithful ways, is actually the opposite. These words that Naomi say, they're more faithful, perhaps, than a lot of the ways that churches do worship today. Walter Brueggemann is a scholar and a professor of Old Testament studies, and he has written a lot about the Psalms. And one of the most important kinds of Psalms in the Psalter is the Psalms of Lament. In fact, they make up the majority of Psalms out of the 150 that we have in our Psalter. And this is what Walter Brueggemann says about the language and tone of the Psalms. And I think it'll be on the screen as well. But hear these words about what Brueggemann says. These kinds of words that we find in the Lament Psalms do the work of helping people to die completely to the old situation, the old possibility, the old false hopes. To say as dramatically as possible, that is all over now. These words become a voice for the dying in which we are all engaged. Because the world is a place of death and is passing away, and because God gives new life, but only in the pain of death. Naomi's words, the words of the psalmist, the words of Job, the words of Nightbird thousands of years later, it's all pointing to this idea that we have to die completely to old situations if we want to move forward with the God who is living, who is with us, who calls us forward into being with God and God's people. And so these extreme words that we find in lament psalms, that we find in Ruth 1, we're called to say them, to practice them, to make them part of our prayer language, because they actually help us come to grips with the pain and suffering that we face in the world. They help us be honest about our situation, and they help us develop new vision for the God that does not abandon us, but is still working even in the midst of sorrow and brokenness and darkness. You see, Ruth the Moabite, she's a sign, a symbol. She reminds us that God's presence does not flee when we are suffering. Ruth points us back to the faithful love of God that gives us space and voice to grieve and lament, but is still there, holding on to us, not letting us go. You see, when we fall apart, when we are shattered by this world, by the grief that we endure, God is there to collect the pieces, to hold them all, that one is not lost, and to put us back together in perhaps a new but equally beautiful way. That God does not abandon us when we suffer, but God draws even closer and endures it with us in steadfast love. This hesed of God, this faithful covenantal love, it doesn't prevent suffering, but it promises to feel it with us and to make something even more beautiful come from it when all is said and done. Nightbird kept writing in that blog post, God is on the bathroom floor, and this is how she ends the blog post. She says, "Count me among the angry, the cynical, the offended, the hardened, but count me also among the friends of God. Even on days when I'm not so sick, sometimes I lay on the bathroom mat in the afternoon light to listen for God. I know it sounds crazy and I can't really explain it, but God is in there, even now. I have heard it said that some people can't see God because they won't look low enough, and it's true. If you can't see God, look lower. God is on the bathroom floor. God is on the bathroom floor. God is on the bathroom floor. God is here at this table, ready to meet you with whatever you're carrying. Whether you're going through extreme trauma in a season that won't seem to end, whether it's the everyday, ordinary griefs that we all collect along the way, God invites you to bring it all forward, to bear it with hands that are open. God promises to meet us here in this bread and cup and to give us what we need. Because we trust that when we come forward and receive the bread dipped in juice, and as we take it into our own hearts, God sticks to us, clings to us, just as we cling to him. So come forward. Bring it all with you. God is not afraid. God's on the bathroom floor.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.